I'm Nate.
And I'm Rob.
And this is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. It is January the 22nd, 2020. We decided it would be fun to record an episode talking about a couple films that both of us have seen recently, separate from each other, and then maybe discuss some other films we may have seen, TV shows, books we're reading. Just kind of a general, what are you watching, what are you consuming media-wise recently. This first film we're going to talk about, and these two films, the principal films on this podcast, are absolutely nothing like each other. So it's kind of an odd mix. But we're going to be talking about the 1958 film Run Silent, Run Deep. I had known of this film for quite some time. I have vague memories of seriously considering checking this out from a Hollywood video circa 2002, but I ultimately did not, and instead watched it about a week or so ago. I talked to or texted Rob about it, and you had been aware of the film.
I own this film. It's been on my list of films to see for a long time, but...
How did you come to own it?
On my brother's recommendation. My brother thinks that this is... A long time ago, he told me this is his favorite World War II movie, and he thinks this is probably the best submarine movie ever made.
I think he's got... that's a strong argument can be made. I think it's really between... this and Hunt for Red October.
Yep.
Though thinking of sub-films...
There's also Das Boot.
There's Das Boot. There's Crimson Tide.
Yeah.
Frank Capra did an early film called Submarine back in the 30s, which I don't 100% recall if I ever saw.
Yeah.
I think I did.
But I've been meaning to watch this film for quite a while. Just sometimes when you're trying to... I don't want to say you have to be old to watch this film, but it does require a certain maturity to pick a 1958 black and white over more contemporaneous films. I'm really glad I got around to seeing this, though.
Yeah, it was. It's available, at least at this point, it's available at Amazon. I just kind of stumbled on it. I'm like, I've wanted to see this for a while, so I'll watch it.
Well, and when Nate told me it was available on Amazon, this is, I guess you could just say I'm being lazy, but it's easier to stream a movie than it is to go and get the DVD and, things like that and get it set up. For me, I have to play it through my PS4. I don't have a DVD player at home anymore. So I have to put it in my PS4 and whatnot. So it's just a little bit more laborious to go get a DVD than it is to turn on a streaming service.
21st century first world problems.
Yes.
So this film is directed by Robert Wise, who's a very solid director. Had a long career over quite a few genres. He directed The Day the Earth Stood Still. He directed the original film version of West Side Story. Steven Spielberg's remake is due out this coming December, I believe. I also directed The Sand Pebbles. I want to say he directed The Sound of Music. He directed Star Trek The Motion Picture. Very prolific, very capable director. This is the two principal leads in this are Clark Gable. This is one of his last film roles. He would pass away 2 years later in 1960. And Burt Lancaster, fairly mid-ish career, early to mid-career. Clark Gable is a man who was a commander of an American submarine during World War II that is patrolling this particularly troublesome spot in the South Pacific. I think it's called Sector 12.
Sector 7.
Sector 7. And there's a specific strait or something in that area where a lot of submarines have been taken down by the Japanese. Clark Gable is commanding his sub, and they are sunk by the Japanese. Gable survives, as well as a number of his crewmates, but most of the crew go down with the ship. They're picked up. Gable, we then flash forward about a year. Clark Gable's been given a desk job in Hawaii. He's been angling to get another command because he's been obsessing over what happened to his ship, and he wants to get back there. He believes he can stop whatever Japanese boat has been
decimating the U.S. Navy, in particular the submarine fleet.
He wants to get revenge. He wants to kind of not justify, but
vindicate
himself. Yeah. So he eventually succeeds. He manages to wing another command. There's another boat submarine whose commanding officer is being transferred.
Is he being transferred or promoted?
I think he is being promoted.
Yeah.
We never actually... No, we see him very briefly, I think.
Yeah, well, he has a conversation with Burt Lancaster's character.
Yeah. So Burt Lancaster is his first officer.
Port. They're coming into Pearl, and as they're coming in, they have a conversation.
Yeah. So Burt Lancaster is the first officer. Both he and his crew suspect that he's going to be promoted to commanding officer, and he's very pissed off when he doesn't get that promotion.
Yeah.
In fact, he's so pissed off that he tracks down Clark Gable, and he knows at least some of the backstory of what happened to him. Shows up at his house. Clark Gable's out in his yard trimming his tree.
Yeah.
And tries to have a confrontation. Gable tries to
He asks for permission to transfer.
Yeah, and Gable's like, no.
Yeah. Says, I know I need you on my sub.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the crew loves him.
Yeah.
You've got an interesting supporting cast for the crew. I think probably the best known person in it is Don Rickles.
Yeah,
who's
who
kind of
plays
there
a quartermaster first class.
Yeah, he's kind of comic relief. They've got a nice little combination of supporting characters there. The other name would be Jack Warden as Yeoman First Class Mueller. Jack Warden would probably be best known to people of our age group playing, I want to say his character's name is Jack Healy. He is the grandfather in the Problem Child films. But he was a very prolific actor. He's in a very good film called The Verdict, where he's kind of Paul Newman's kind of assistant in a legal matter. He also plays the President of the United States in one of my favorite films, which is the film Being There from 1979, directed by Hal Ashby, and it's the second to last film that was made by Peter Sellers. And Jack Warden plays an ineffectual 1970s style Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter type president of the United States.
Yeah.
But he's good in this. And there's really not that much really to say about the story other than when Clark Gable comes in, he is a little bit eccentric and the crew doesn't entirely know what to make of his orders. He has them doing drills constantly.
Yeah, I mean, they're doing some very specific drills, and he wants something very specific from them in this drill, or a very specific result of the drill. And it's very apparent at first that nobody knows why they're doing this. And then at one point, they encounter some Japanese ships, and but because of cover of darkness, they're not discovered. And so he says, we're not going to engage him, let's just keep going. And the crew thinks he's a coward, that he's scared because of his previous boat having been sunk. And then they encounter a Japanese battleship, a whole flotilla, and he decides he's going to prove his point, and he takes them on then. But he makes decisions that the whole crew thinks he's gone crazy as he takes on this Japanese battleship and a head-on, he wants it to come head-on at him so that he can get a bow shot. And by taking and making the bow shot, he proves to his crew, I've got a strategy that gives us the advantage and we can take down this battleship that's been sinking all of the U.S. submarines.
Now, they had been assigned to Sector 7.
Yeah.
But they had been told very specifically to stay out of this strait, which
is
been
where
a
all the submarines have been going down.
Yeah. But Clark Gable is very single-minded. His goal is to get in a position where he can take down this phantom boat, or this boat that's been felling the submarines. But things end up a little more complicated than they thought, because they do bring down this boat, only discover this boat has not been what's been doing it. There's been a submarine that's been tailing this boat and actually been...
Yeah, so they have an initial encounter with the battleship where they think that their torpedoes have missed and that a rogue torpedo is coming back on them. The submarine is heavily damaged. They actually have to spend 2 weeks making repairs to the submarine.
That's a very tense sequence.
Yeah. And there's real consequences for this. There's a couple of the crew that are killed by things that happen in the torpedo room. The Commander Rich Richardson, played by Clark Gable, is also injured in this scene. And as a result of what happens here, Lieutenant Jim Bledsoe, basically they mutiny and they take the boat away from Commander Richardson. And he says, as soon as our repairs are done, we're going to head back into Pearl. And Commander Richardson tries to warn him and says, look, if you go back into Pearl with 15 torpedoes on this boat, you're never going to have a command of another boat. But so make sure you're sure about this. And they start, certain things lead Lieutenant Jim Bledsoe to realize, hey, maybe Commander Richardson isn't totally up in the night on this. And they end up re-engaging the Japanese, and that's when they discover this submarine that's been coming in really deep under the water. behind this flotilla, and it's the submarine is what's responsible for having. It turns out this Japanese submarine is what's responsible for having sunk all of the American submarines, and there is just an epic battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is really great. One of the things I liked about this film is it went in a direction I wasn't expecting it to go into. It kind of set things up. It's like, okay, I know what this is. The commanding officer and the CO they don't like each other, and there's going to be this conflict between them. And this is part of the film. And I thought that this was going to take the track of a very famous World War II Navy film that came out 5 or so years before this, The Caine Mutiny.
Oh, yeah.
And you can know from the title, The Caine Mutiny, what that film is about. And there's a little bit of a mutiny in this. But after Clark Gable was injured and been relieved of command, the gears are going in Burt Lancaster's brain, and he eventually kind of pieces together kind of what the commanding officer was getting at, and that we can do this thing.
Yeah.
And kind of vindicates, which is what Clark Gable had been after.
Well, but the Burt Lancaster, to his credit, that character, to his credit, is the crew is starting to speculate and wanting to mutiny earlier in the film. He stands up for Clark Gable's character, Commander Richardson, and defends what he's trying to do and to the rest of the crew and says, no, you have to follow your commander, whether you like it or not, whether, he's got the commander's prerogative to ignore his orders and whatnot. But then he ends up figuring out, like you said, the wheels are turning, and he figures out what the commander was trying to do. And so he ends up going back and completing the commander's mission. And did we spoil the ending?
Yeah, our podcasts are spoiler heavy.
Yeah.
Hopefully you knew this coming in. So we are spoiling this 60-something-year-old film, 62-year-old film.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have to give spoiler warnings on a film this old, but Commander Richardson does not make it back. He's come down with an ailment after this first battle with the battleship and the submarine, and he has this condition where if he doesn't lie flat and take it easy, he's putting himself at risk. And as they re-engage the Japanese again, he comes to offer advice to the Burt Lancaster lieutenant.
Advice
Jim
that proves
Bledsoe.
to be essential.
Yeah, well, essential and critical. And as a result of him getting out of his bunk and coming to help, he ends up perishing as a result.
They have a little burial at sea at the end there. And it's a wonderful little kind of unexpected arc where, he's there and then he kind of strains things. And then in the end, he redeems himself, and Burt Lancaster
and
sees
his
the wisdom. The crew ends up liking him again.
Well, he redeems his crew that he's lost.
Yeah.
At the very beginning of the film that you don't actually see, but yeah.
It's a good film.
I love this film. It does things that films nowadays are afraid to do. I mean, there's stakes in this. Like, even though Commander Richardson is trying to redeem himself, and he's doing things with his submarine, he's realizing the results of what he's doing because these guys die in the torpedo room, and he ends up having to use their bodies as decoys to convince the Japanese that they've sunk him. Of course, there's things that happen in the brief aftermath of this that end up being how they figure out how the Japanese have been following them, how they've been figuring out who the boats are, things of that nature. Basically, the Japanese are picking up their trash.
Yeah.
But they end up at one point to convince the Japanese that they've sunk this submarine. They, instead of just letting up an oil slick, they load all the trash into the torpedo tubes along with the bodies of the 3 dead sailors, and send up an oil slick with the dead bodies and all the trash. And that's how they convince the Japanese that they've sunk them, and they're able to spend the 2 weeks repairing the boat and re-engage. And yeah,
that is my favorite sequence in this film, is when things turn south in that early engagement. And they're underwater, and you have the model work with the depth charges going down, and sometimes they bounce off the side of the boat, and you're just, and then they go off, and it's just wonderfully tense and cramp, and you're on a certain level, you're like, am I going to make it? It's like, you more or less know they are, because it's a mainstream film of its time, but like, it's really tense. It's really well done. And it's what elevates this to the top of the whole submarine subgenre.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, the fact that they're not afraid to then turn around at the end, Commander Richardson is, if this was made today, Commander Richardson would make it back to Pearl Harbor. People are afraid to have a negative ending or a sad ending to a movie anymore. But no, Commander Richardson, he gives it his all and he dies at sea. And I loved that. I mean, for me, I gave this movie 4 stars. On the 10-star scale, I rated it 9 stars.
Yeah. I would give this film 3.5 stars, probably 8 stars on the 10-star scale.
Yeah, I loved this film.
Yeah, very impressive.
Yeah.
So we highly recommend that you see Run Silent, Run Deep. I think we're going to have a different or a more mixed reception to the second film, which we watched. And all I want to tell you before Rob gets into it is this is a film I first became aware of. I had the day off from work for some things that I had to do on Tuesday, and I first became aware of this from a text you sent me that I read around 11.
Well, and there was kind of a weird sequence of things that happened. I caught some sort of stomach bug over the weekend, and so Monday I was planning to take the day off anyway, but I ended up just sitting at home, which is when I watched Run Silent, Run Deep, and then I was just thumbing around through stuff on Amazon, and honestly, I don't even know how I got to it. But I was just thumbing through stuff on Amazon, and I came across a title called Velocipastor.
Velocipastor.
And I couldn't help but do a double take because it's just such a crazy name. The basic outline of the plot is after losing his parents, a priest travels to China wherein he inherits a mysterious ability that allows him to turn into a dinosaur. At first horrified by this new power, a hooker convinces the pastor to use these powers to fight crime and ninjas. And I read the description and I was just like, what in the hell? And so I texted Nate, and Nate apparently thought it was comedic enough. He decided he was going to watch it.
Well, I had kind of mixed feelings about it. What's really funny is I think we mentioned Wilson before.
Yeah,
on
there's
this
a
podcast,
mutual friend of ours who
we
then
met on the
posted
mission.
a meme online that was like, the perfect movie doesn't it? And then someone puts up a poster
the
of
perfect
Velocipastor.
movie doesn't exist. Oh, yeah? Well, this is, yeah.
Yeah.
So all within the period of hours.
I mean, we're talking probably a period of 2 hours all of this happened.
So I first became aware that this even existed as a film about 11 o'clock on Tuesday. I started watching it about 7:50 that night. I was going back and forth because I'm like, oh, this is going to be bad. But it's only an hour and 10 minutes. And I think if we both watch it, we can talk about it. And we're always looking for things to talk about on the podcast. I watched the preview, and then I started it. And very quickly, I got into its groove. I really liked Velocipastor. I recommend, not to everybody, but I can recommend Velocipastor.
And I did not like this movie at all.
You did not like it.
I got lost they lost me very early in this film.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you specifically where I got lost. Now, again, we're a fairly spoiler-heavy podcast, so if you actually have any interest, based on the description I just read to you, of watching Velocipastor, go watch this before you before you listen to the rest of this.
We'll wait.
But in the beginning of the film, so the opening of the film, this pastor, his parents are at his congregation or something.
So he's finished his sermon.
And they go out and they're getting in the car, and this gangster from the neighborhood blows up his parents' car, and his parents are killed in it. Where they lost me, though, is they flash back to the parking stall, and it's printed on the screen, insert VFX car explosion here.
That may be what won me over. The thing that turned you off.
I mean, so clearly they had an intention of at some point inserting some form of CG here or something.
No, they didn't.
You could have done this. You could have done, because they do this prolonged, the pastor's reaction. They could have gone back and just shown the parents' bodies in the street without ever having shown the car. There's so many things they could have done in the lines with all of the rest of the special effects they're going to do in this movie that, for me, would have been better. Yeah, it was just dumb.
I thought this was the perfect decision for this film. Now, I looked into this a little bit.
I have too.
This is not a professional film. This is an amateur film.
Yeah.
This is, I would say, a pretty high-end amateur film. What I saw online indicated this was made for a budget of $35,000. I
think I could have done it for $10,000.
The joke, have you ever seen Sharknado?
No.
Or any of those kind of...
I haven't.
I'm forgetting the name of the studio that produces these things all the time. This is much better than Sharknado, or that kind of film, which has, even though it has a small budget by the standards of a big Hollywood film, has a tremendous budget by the standards of Velocipastor. It's like a film you would make and put on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's charmingly bottom of the barrel budget-wise and amateurish, and it knows it is. I actually think this looks pretty darn good for a film that only cost $35,000 to make. But again, as I said, it's like something you might see on YouTube. I wonder if at one point that was the intention.
Well, my understanding is that this guy made a similar movie when he was younger.
Mm-hmm.
It won some sort of amateur award, and then he got some funding to remake this as an actual.
Yeah, kind of like Napoleon Dynamite was originally a very short film, and then it was expanded, and then a film that we had both seen online, Kung Fury, which had David Hasselhoff did the theme song.
Oh,
it was
yeah.
the spoof of 80s action films and time travel movies, and that film was made for a lot more than this, but it is going to be turned into a feature-length film in the near future. I don't know. I was charmed by this. I was thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, there's in many ways nothing to it. It's absolutely ridiculous, but there wasn't really weak spots for me in this. Like, I was entertained throughout. It's only 70-minute long film. I think it would have been a mistake to make it really any longer than that.
Yeah.
But for what it is, it's got the right tone. It's got the right tongue-in-cheek quality. The lead actor in this, Greg Cohen, as Doug Jones, the pastor, the Velocipastor, there's a few moments where just he plays it straight. And some of his expressions, like when he's being told that, it's like, you turned into a velociraptor and you killed these people. And it's like, what?
I did feel like...
What?
I did feel like there was a few weak spots. I've already mentioned the first one. The second part is, of course, the pastor falls for the prostitute. And so after they've had their first night together, the ninjas jump through the window into the apartment.
That made me laugh out loud.
It made me laugh out loud as well. It was atrocious.
It comes out of nowhere. You just have this camera shot kind of at such an angle that you can see Doug Jones and Carol, the prostitute, in bed. It's quiet, and then whoop, ninjas through the window with no warning at all. They just jump right into.
And so the Velocipastor has to fight the ninjas, and then of course he and the prostitute kiss afterwards. Now that her name is actually Carol, it's portrayed by a lady named Alyssa Kempinski. She's a beautiful young lady. She's fine in the role. She actually is probably the best actor in the movie.
She's, I think, the only one that's really an actor.
I thought Greg Cohen was
Greg
too.
Cohen had been in some things, but Alyssa had been... Carol had been in an episode of The Deuce, which is the HBO show about the porn scene in the 70s, in which she plays a prostitute in that as well. Again, she's cute. Yeah.
And then the final culmination, the final battle with the ninjas.
Well,
I mean, there's this whole... This is almost two movies in one, because there's this whole part where the guy who has blown up the pastor's parents then comes into the confession booth and confesses some of his crimes, and then the pastor can't control himself, and so he kills the gangster, And
we should try to...
I actually kind of liked that part.
That was fun. What was his name? His character's name was Frankie
Mermaid, yeah.
Why is my name Frankie Mermaid?
I don't remember.
Because you swim in... It is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So he's a wonderfully 70s pimp. I'm going to try to briefly encapsulate kind of the story, because there is a story. So Doug Jones is a pastor. He's apparently a Catholic priest, even though the one time that we get a good look at the church, it says it's a Church of Christ.
Yeah.
Which is completely different denominationally. So he's a pastor. He finishes giving a sermon. They don't have any budget for extras, so during his sermon scenes, you can tell he's preaching to an empty church, basically, or a couple crew members, but they never show the pews or anything. So he finishes his sermon, he walks outside his church, sees his parents Like they've stopped by and it's my parents, and then they have they cut away.
They have the sound effects.
They have the sound effects, and then it says like the insert visual effects.
Car explosion.
They never had any intention to.
See, but they could have, because they do this prolonged...
No, it's funnier without it.
See, but there's this prolonged scene of, like, watching his reaction, and they could have just turned around, because they play the sound effect while they're doing his reaction. They could have just turned around and, like, had it been, like, the parents got blown out of the car.
That's why it's great, is that they didn't do that. But, so he's, obviously, this is difficult for him. So his father...
George Schweitzer, it's credited down at the bottom, Doug's dad.
No, well, no, his the other priest, Father Stewart.
Oh, Father Stewart, Daniel Steer.
Daniel Steer.
Which is, I believe, the writer.
Brandon Steer is the writer and director, so I'm assuming that Daniel Steer is his father or uncle or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, Father Stewart says you should take some time off, go someplace where, because you're having a faith crisis, go someplace where you don't think that God can reach you, and if he reaches you there, then you know your faith's good. So he goes to China. They use the same woods to be China, the woods in whatever part of the United States this film's supposed to be set in. New York. And then later there's a Vietnam flashback to give us some backstory to Father Stewart's character, all in the exact same woods. And when they first show Doug Jones, who oddly is always called Doug Jones rather than like Father, they don't really...
Yeah.
Which is odd. They show the New York State woods and the China in huge font on the screen. He's kind of wandering around through the woods, and there's this lady that's being pursued by somebody with bows and arrows. She's holding some kind of artifact. She gets hit. Doug Jones takes the artifact. She's trying to communicate to him, but he doesn't speak Chinese, that you need to destroy this. But he's like, you want me to take this? And I think it's supposed to be like a dinosaur bone?
I don't recall.
Or maybe like a
I was
claw.
so upset at this point of the car explosion still that I was just ignoring it.
Anyway, and then she says something about Dragon Warrior. And you later find out this stone, because of his contact with it, when he gets real angry, he transforms into a Velociraptor, which really looks more like a T-Rex, because there's a T-Rex suit and mechanic. Not the really crappy ones you see on YouTube, a slightly better one, but still not a very good one.
Yeah.
When he gets really upset, he turns into the Velocipastor and he kills. And so he comes back to the States, goes back to service in the church. He's walking at night, and Carol, who's a prostitute, in order to get money to go through college to become... I think there was a joke in what she was becoming. I forget if it was...
Wasn't she going to medical school or something?
If it was a very specific type of doctor or like a doctor-lawyer or some kind of joke that I didn't quite catch. But anyway, she's on the outs with her pimp.
Is she working for Frankie Mermaid?
For Frankie Mermaid, yeah. So they have a confrontation early on where they indicate Frankie Mermaid's pretty abusive. And she's... her assignment is the park to go look for tricks. And she is accosted by some criminals. And Dougie Jones is walking around, sees what's happening, turns into the Velocipastor, rips the crap out of these guys. And then when he comes to, he's naked in a bed that he doesn't know. And Carol has taken him to her place. They have this kind of obvious joke where he thinks that they've had sex. And he's like, oh, that was amazing. Was that your first time? And he's like, oh, crap. It's like, no, I'm talking about when you turned into a dinosaur and killed these people. It's like, what? I did what?
Yeah. She takes him out of the woods and shows him the remains.
He freaks out. Oh, and takes him out to the woods in one of her dresses, because when he turns into Velocipastor, I guess
his clothes were destroyed.
Destroyed his clothes. And so he's like, I don't want anything to do with this. And actually...
That was one of the most likable scenes where he's walking around in her dress, and...
I believe that scene has my favorite 2 lines in the film. When actually a little earlier, when she's telling him, you turned into this dinosaur. First off, dinosaurs never existed.
Yeah.
Secondly... if they did exist, I don't turn into one.
Yeah.
I loved it. Anyway, he goes I got to go to confession. He's got to go, and I guess his shift in the confessional booth. So he goes there. Frankie Mermaid shows up, confesses to all this horrible stuff he did, including killing Doug Jones' parents. This makes Doug Jones angry. His arms turn into the Velociraptor arms, and he kills Frankie Mermaid. Realizes, I think I need to use these powers for good. I think that killing this man was probably a good thing. Goes to Carol, and they work together to kind of learn more about dinosaurs.
Well, not only that, but they
fighting.
also decide that between her skills and his being a priest, that they're going to be able to find the worst people in society for him to go and kill as a dinosaur.
And he does. And there's montage sequences. They're getting kind of close as all this is going on. This attracts the attention of Father Stewart, who doesn't like the idea that his associate is spending so much time with a prostitute.
Yeah.
Eventually, he more or less abducts or locks up Doug Jones, takes him to a friend of his who's like a Satanist or into the occult. An exorcist.
But not an officially sanctioned exorcist.
Yeah, not an officially sanctioned. And he has this joke, well, sometimes you got to do evil to do good. It's like, that's what I've been saying about me turning into a dinosaur and kill this. But arguing, so, oh, this is different. This is different. They attempt to exorcise the dragon warrior spirit from him, but he ends up attacking Father Stewart in this process. He thinks he's killed Father Stewart, but he really hasn't. We have a flashback to Father Stewart explaining how he met this evil exorcist, which is the Vietnam flashback. Which is in the same freaking woods that is every woods in this
totally
movie.
Disconnected from anything else.
Yeah.
And gratuitous. And
yeah. And how he was going to marry this girl who somehow shows up in Vietnam, like to visit him, and gets killed
steps on a
landmine. And so he gets totally covered with this fake blood. And there's like a throwaway line, oh, I decided then that I'd get back into priesthood.
Yeah.
And anyway, Father Stewart was not killed. He is abducted by this group that we see earlier that was after the Dragon Warrior artifact. And there's a twist about there's actually a couple twists about this group. So this group is responsible for drug running and prostitution and a lot of crooked stuff, but they are also very devout Catholics. And their plan is they use all of this evil stuff, these sins, so that people will get so low that they will go to the church to get right with God.
Yeah.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
It's terrible.
And then the bad leader of this group of Catholic ninjas, renegade Catholic ninjas, has an assistant who, in a ridiculous twist at the end, turns out to be the younger brother of Doug Jones, even though in other flashbacks we've seen that Doug's parents say that especially his dad says, you're our only son.
Yeah.
And then when they re-show these flashbacks, you see the other son in the background just get like pissed off about it.
Yeah.
This just worked for me. It's absolutely ridiculous. It ends in a confrontation with the ninjas. Doug Jones becomes Velocipastor, thinks Carol has died. Carol hasn't actually died. And at the end, they are teaming up to have further adventures. He's left the priesthood because the Catholic Church is responsible for all the bad things that happen in the world, so they need to go and stop these Catholic-run crime rings. It's absolutely ridiculous. I really liked it.
It's very tongue-in-cheek, but yeah, it lost me early on, and there were a couple fun scenes, but it's not good.
It is good.
Yeah. What would you rate it?
That's really hard to say.
Granted, this is very tongue-in-cheek. You'd only recommend it to certain people.
I actually recommended it to someone today.
I'm not surprised in the slightest. There's people I would like to see watch this film, but I'm not going to broadly recommend this film. I enjoyed parts of it, but overall I didn't necessarily enjoy it. Yeah, it's on Amazon Prime. If you have any inclination, go check it out. It's short. It's only 75 minutes.
I watch a good amount of YouTube, and I've seen films kind of like this done on YouTube, but this was better. There's actually a couple sequences. There's this sequence where he's flashing back about his experience with Carol, and they have, I don't know how many sub-screens on the screen at the same time where they're showing their memories together. Like, that's like complicated. Like, that's impressive editing, which just contrasts very enjoyably with some really crappy editing and crappy effects in other parts of the film. But it's its own thing. It's Velocipastor. I don't think you could have probably done a better Velocipastor. Well, you could have done it with more money, but the fact that it was as good as it is, as smart as it is on the budget that it has, I just really liked it. I guess I'd have to call it a guilty pleasure film.
Yeah. So what else have you been watching lately?
I've been watching a number of things. I watched a film the other night. Well, I've seen a couple films theatrically recently, in the last tour, since last weekend or last Thursday, since last Thursday, and which at some point we may have to talk about in more detail. But I did finally see 1917. Saw it on the IMAX screen, which is the way to see it. I really, really liked it.
I'll be seeing that coming up. My wife bought the Oscar movie pass. Mm-hmm. And so here in about 10 days, I'm going to be going to all of them in about a week.
Well, we'll have to talk about this. I don't know if I'll do the Oscar pass or if I'll get to all of the nominees. There's 9 nominees this year. I think I've probably seen about 5 of them.
Yeah.
Maybe 6 of them. But I quite liked that. I'd probably say it's probably the 3rd or 4th favorite film, best film I've seen of 2019. Yeah. I finally saw The Irishman.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I was
Where
thinking...
did you catch up on that?
Well, my plan was, I don't have streaming Netflix, but my mother does. I was going to go up and visit family in a month or so, and I was probably going to watch it then, but the Oscars will be over by then. And I actually saw it down at Thanksgiving Point, and I'd never been to the Thanksgiving Point Theater, and I've been here for almost 5 years.
I've never been down there either.
So I'm like, this is an excuse to go down there. It was Sunday morning at like 10-something or like 11:10. I had some free movie passes, and it was free popcorn day. So
that was the day I was sick. So.
Yeah, I sprung a little bit more to get the super comfy seat because I'm going to be sitting here for 3.5 hours. I really liked it. That's another one that we could talk about in more detail at some point if and when you see it. It's really a capstone film for a lot of things.
I was actually going to propose that we sit down and watch that here in the near future before the Oscars come up, but yeah, I think I'll be catching up with it. Wasn't it nominated for Best Picture?
Yeah, it is nominated.
So I'll be catching up with it here in about a week, but yeah.
I could talk about it at some length. But yeah, I liked both of those films quite a bit. Last night I watched a film called The Lodger from 1954. This is a Jack the Ripper story. It's actually been made into a film quite a few times. We know very little about Jack the Ripper. Actually, there's some pretty strong arguments that we know a lot about Jack the Ripper, but obviously this is a fictionalized expansion on that story. Alfred Hitchcock made a version of this story called The Lodger as a late silent film, one of his early films. And then it has been remade periodically. It was remade again in the 40s. It was remade as recently as 2009. This film stars Jack Palance as Jack the Ripper. He's not a doctor, but he's a medical researcher, a pathologist who's committing these Ripper murders. And he rents a room as well as the attic of this house to perform because he actually is doing medical research, but he's also satisfying this need to kill. And the couple that he is staying with, the wife, is Aunt Bee from the Andy Griffith Show.
Oh, yeah.
And she, very early on, is like, I think this guy's the Ripper. But everybody thinks she's a busybody and not to listen to her. But she's all right. And their niece comes to stay with them, and he kind of falls in love with the niece. And I thought it was really good. I thought it was quite good. I'd probably give it about 3 stars. Jack Palance is quite good in this. I was watching a documentary on Jack Palance recently. He came on very strong. He had like 2 Oscar nominations within the first 3 or 4 years of his acting in films, and then he has this long period in which he doesn't get another nomination until City Slickers, for which he ultimately wins as Curly.
Yeah.
There's a funny story in that documentary about Jack Palance's film debut was in a film called Panic in the Streets, which is an Elia Kazan film. Elia Kazan generally did kind of weighty dramas. Gentleman's Agreement, A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront. But this was basically a thriller.
Yeah.
And it's about these hoodlums, one of which is played by Zero Mostel and one is played by Jack Palance, that get exposed to the plague because they're roughing up this guy who snuck into the country illegally on this boat, and he's carrying the plague with him. And this is in New Orleans. And Richard Widmark plays a man working for the CDC who realizes that the plague has gotten out, and he figures out that these two guys have been exposed to it. So him and other authorities are trying to find them to contain the plague outbreak and to get them treated. But they think that Richard Widmark's like a cop or the FBI or something is trying to arrest them for the illegal things they've been doing. So they're trying desperately to keep away. I really think this movie should be remade. This is a good movie. But anyway, it was Jack Palance's first theatrical film, and he was really excited. He was perhaps too excited. He got too into the part. And there's a scene in which he's supposed to hit Richard Widmark, and he doesn't hold back because he's too excited. And he knocks Richard Widmark out for 20 minutes.
Wow.
Which led to a recurring joke that Widmark would say, it's like, the only actor in Hollywood that I truly fear is Jack Palance. But Palance is a solid actor. We think of him almost entirely for his westerns.
Yeah.
But he's good. Ukrainian extraction, actually.
Yeah.
He's got a very distinct look.
I read this was several years ago, but I read now I'm blanking on his name, from City Slickers.
Billy Crystal.
Yeah, I read the Billy Crystal autobiography, and he talks a lot about him and, when they got him to play Curly on City Slickers too, and yeah, a lot of great memories there from Billy Crystal.
Yeah. But yeah, so I have maybe one or two other things I could talk about, but what have you been consuming media-wise?
I've mostly been streaming some TV shows. I've been trying to catch up on The Americans, so I went clear back to the beginning and started The Americans over, and then my wife and I also, in the last week, 10 days, we binged the entirety, all 3 seasons of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
All 3 seasons in about how long?
About 10 days.
So the first season and the third season, I want to say, are 8 episodes, and then the second season is like 10 episodes. So that's 20...
In fact, we did the entire third season this last weekend.
26 episodes.
Yeah. We got into it, and so every night we would watch an episode or two, and my wife's a teacher, so she goes to bed relatively early, but she was staying up past her bedtime every night because we were enjoying it so much. And then this weekend, we had the long weekend with Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and so Saturday, we started Friday night and with season 3 and continued Saturday, watched a bunch of it Saturday and finished it off on Sunday. So, yeah.
That's a fun show.
That's a great show. I've really enjoyed that show.
Amy Sherman Palladino, who did Gilmore Girls.
Yeah.
There's certainly a strain of that in this film, though it's its own real distinct thing.
Oh yeah, I've heard it also referred to as Gilmore Girls if they could swear, and you could certainly see that.
Yeah, I think more so in season 3.
Yeah.
There's one particular character that has a foul mouth, but it gets to be more intense. In fact, my mom loves Gilmore Girls, but I am a little reluctant to recommend this.
Yeah. Has your sister watched this?
I don't think so, but it's on her list.
Yeah. I really enjoyed this series. There are people, because of the language, who I wouldn't recommend it to, but it deals with real things, and yeah, it's just a great show. It's
really a creative concept. I don't know where she got this from, but Mrs. Maisel is a kind of upper-ish class Jewish woman in New York in the 1950s. The pilot episode has concerned itself with her marriage, and then by the end of the episode, so the marriage is a kind of a prequel sequence, a preface, and then it flashes forward to about 4 or 5 years into the marriage. It's 1958, and her husband is trying to be a stand-up comedian, but he's really not very good at it. And they end up having this kind of fight that grows out of something that happens at one of his shows, and he tells his wife, I can't do this anymore, and I've been cheating on you. And it leads to an estrangement, which leads to a divorce, This is a woman who thought she knew how her life would go, and she's so frustrated that she goes to the club and she just gets up on an open mic situation and she just kind of vents, and she's hilarious. And one of the people that work at this particular club just sees something in her that she's going to be a star, and convinces her to pursue stand-up comedy, and that this other person's acting as her agent. But at first, she wants to hide it from her family because this is not something a housewife does in the 1950s. But it's very creative. It's got a wonderful sense of place to it. It has to deal a lot with the Jewish subculture and with New York.
Yeah, it's also got a great cast. I enjoy seeing Tony Shalhoub again.
Yeah, Tony Shalhoub as her father.
He's great. Yeah.
It's Rachel Brosnan.
I'm blanking on her name right now.
She's very good. She's been in a number of things. She was on a show I watched called Manhattan, about the Manhattan Project.
Oh, yeah?
She was also in the first few seasons of House of Cards.
Yeah. I also recently, just with some work-related things, I've gone through some audio content as well. I recently finished 2 audiobooks. The first was the biography of Robin Williams by David Itzikov. Those who know me know I'm a big Robin Williams fan. I talk about Robin Williams with Nate all the time. In fact, we did a Robin Williams month several years ago, and that is still to this day is one of my favorite months that we ever did. That's a great biography. It's very well done. I felt like it did a good job of capturing a lot of elements of Robin Williams and what he went through in his life, and it deals very heavily with the end of his life as well. And then I listened to a ton of podcasts, which is how I got turned on to the second book. It's called American Predator, which is about Israel Keyes, who is probably one of the least known serial killers in the U.S., but a successful and speculated as to how prolific serial killer he was. He was captured at one point and was cooperating with the FBI, giving them information before he committed suicide in his cell. So it's not actually ever known it's not known at this point, and we will likely never fully determine how many people he killed. But it has also spawned some podcasts that talk about him. Probably if you're interested in him, the best podcast to go check out about him is called True Crime Bullshit, which is a line that he says in one of his FBI interrogations. The unique thing about Israel Keyes is he did not want media attention. In fact, he wanted to plead out a deal where he would be put to death very quickly, so that his case would not garner very much media attention. And it was when the FBI loses control of the case and some state prosecutors in Vermont start to talk about the case, is when he goes and commits suicide, so that his kids won't be affected by what he has done.
So he was committing most of his crimes in New England?
All over the place.
All over the place.
In Alaska, in Washington State, in Vermont. He was actually picked up in, I can't remember if it was Arizona or New Mexico. He also killed people in Texas. He had kill kits buried all over the country in different parts of the country. There's speculation as to his involvement in cases in Florida and several other states. But yeah, he was all over the place.
What time period was he committing these crimes?
In the last 2 decades.
The last 2 decades.
Yeah.
And what kind of numbers are they thinking?
It depends on who you look at, or whose sources you trust. Anywhere from 7 to as many as 40. Wow. Yeah.
You have a particular type?
Kind of. He also kind of developed as he killed, and he also committed bank robberies to fund his crimes. And towards the end, he was burning down churches. But he had a tendency to, and had a propensity and a skill for finding couples or individuals in an isolated situation, and in several instances, or at least one instance, I mean, in one instance he captures this girl. She's at work at one of those those roadside coffee shops that are basically just a shed in a parking lot. While she's at work in the afternoon or the evening one day, he convinces her he's holding her up, like he's robbing the place, jumps through the window of the place, and holds her up in the thing, and then loads her up into his truck and takes her back to his house, locks her up in a shed, gagged, and dismembers her in the shed on his own property, and then drives out, cuts a hole in a lake, and disposes. That's how he disposes of her body. And this is while his wife and his daughter are in the house next, right there on the property. Wow. And that was the case where he ultimately gets caught. But he had committed previous murders in Vermont, where he captured a couple, took them to an abandoned house, and separately kills them in separate parts of the house. And yeah, that's the case where it ultimately ends up getting exposed, because they were trying to confirm elements of the murder, and so they were digging in a landfill trying to find the remnants of the house so they could find the body, or the bodies of this couple. And it's attracting a lot of attention because it's alongside a highway, so people can see this large FBI production out in the landfill, but nobody's giving any information about what the FBI is doing in the landfill. And eventually the locals, even though the FBI is trying to feed them information saying, look, we can solve this case, they're caving to the pressure and start releasing information. And yeah, because he kind of eventually, the interrogations of this guy were screwed from the beginning. There was a prosecutor who insists on being in the room, which anybody who knows much about prosecutions knows that a prosecutor should never be present during an interrogation. But he's also not a skilled interrogator, but he thinks this is gonna make his name as a prosecutor. And he screws the entire interrogation and gives the power back to Israel Keyes, who relatively quickly figures out that they don't have that much evidence on him. He thought they knew more than they did already and had more evidence against him. Eventually figures out that they don't, and is kind of playing around with them and keeps saying, if you get me this plea deal that I want, then I'll give you all this information. So, yeah. But yeah, there's a podcast, and the author of this book, let me verify the name of the author, Marlene Callahan. They've gotten quite a bit of, they got a hold of the entire FBI files. They got a hold of the recorded interviews. But there's like I said, the podcast, they play quite a bit of the interviews in the podcast.
I don't think I've ever heard of this guy.
Yeah, that's the whole point. He's successful and people don't know about him.
Under the radar.
Yeah. And then after that, I've just been catching up on podcasts because over the holidays I was off quite a bit, so I had quite the backlog of podcasts to catch up on. So I'm still catching up on podcasts, but had to finish those couple books, and yeah.
Well, I guess.
Have you been reading anything?
Yeah, I have been reading something. I recently finished a book called Thunder from the Right, Ezra Taft Benson in Mormonism and Politics.
Yeah.
Politics and Mormonism, which is a selection of essays about Ezra Taft Benson, both as a figure in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who was a longtime apostle, and he was the 13th president of the church from 1985 to 1994. But he had also served as Secretary of Agriculture all 8 years under President Eisenhower, and had become a pretty significant figure on kind of the far right in the 1960s and 70s. He was heavily involved in the John Birch Society and very right-wing politics, which concerned some people in the church, as there's a seniority system that determines the church's presidency, and as it seemed increasingly likely that is an office he would eventually get to. People were nervous that he'd be, take those real right-wing politics and try to push them as president of the church, which ultimately he did not, to the surprise of many people. He had mellowed. He was quite elderly. He was in his 80s by the time he actually became church president, so he wasn't at his top of his game in that area. But there was some interesting stuff in that book, a lot of which I knew at least in broad outline.
Yeah.
There's a lot more details. One thing I did not know is, so he was born in Idaho in 1899. So he's that right age to serve in the First World War. So I guess he enlists. He goes to basic training. He gets sick. He gets like the flu. So they send him home to recuperate. He gets better, and they never call him back. So had he not gotten sick, and had he gone overseas in World War I, he could have died. And if he died, the history of the LDS Church could have been quite different.
Oh, yeah. Drastically different.
Yeah. Eisenhower would have had a different agriculture secretary, and who knows who would have been president of the church during the 80s.
Yeah.
I've been reading a book called I Kid You Not, which is a memoir written by Jack Parr. Jack Parr was the second host of The Tonight Show. He died in 2004, and I remember when he died, and I didn't know very much about him, and I purchased a DVD set from the Shout Factory, which has since grown to be a pretty big purveyor of slightly off-kilter entertainment. And it had a biography of his. It has several episodes of his show. And I got to really like him. And this book is a memoir that he wrote in like 1959. So he took over The Tonight Show in 1957, and he was host there until 62. And then he retired from that and had a primetime show for a few years. And then he basically retired. He continued to write, and he would do TV specials. And I think he may have very briefly returned to late-night television in the 70s, but I may be getting him confused with somebody else. But it's an interesting story. I knew a good deal of it. He was born in Ohio in 1918. He was one of 4 children. He had 2 brothers and a sister. His father was, I believe, second-generation railroad man. And so they moved around the Midwest through his growing up years. He just so happens to be in this downtown in this town when they have a roving reporter doing a man on the street segment for a radio program. So they interview him. He's a kid. He's like 12 years old, something like that. He falls in love with radio. So he ends up getting a job at this radio station. And he keeps getting promoted there. And that means more money. And eventually they're offering him so much money that he manages to convince his parents to let him drop out of high school. So he drops out of high school when he's like a junior to work full-time in radio. Eventually he leaves that town. He goes to a couple different markets in New York and elsewhere. And then World War II happens, and he enlists. And there's some funny stories about his World War II service. Because he'd had the radio experience, he's sent to a unit that is basically a morale unit that helps with USO shows and things. And it is a funny, he actually is able to do a lot of networking through this. He meets Jack Benny. He meets the guy that later becomes his band leader on The Tonight Show. And they're doing a military exercise. They have to do some training exercise, even though they're not really a combat group. And him and 2 other guys figure that the area where they're going to be having this exercise is not very far away from this all-night cafe. So like, we'll just hide out here. And then when everybody goes off, we'll just sneak over to the cafe and we'll just hang out at the cafe all night. So they go and do that. And then they just kind of sneak back to where they need to be for the debrief. They're having the debrief, and the commanding officer is like, I don't know if this has ever happened before, but there's one person here, a first-timer at these exercises who was not captured once. Private Parr, everybody. This just shows what you can accomplish when you put your mind to it.
Yeah.
So he goes over in the South Pacific. He does a lot of emceeing these shows and does a lot of basically stand-up. You know, the soldiers, they really like Jack Benny. They really like Bob Hope. But they loved Jack Parr because he was one of them. He was a soldier. And so when he made these jokes, they knew that they were where he came from. That they came from the same place. And he joked that in the Army, we had only 2 things in great supply, which is homesickness and officers. So I made jokes about homesickness and officers, and that really resonated. And as he's touring, eventually this reporter tracks him down, a reporter from Esquire magazine, that says, I have been trying to find you for weeks. I've been doing stories on the USO shows, and your name keeps coming up. Everybody loves you. So I wanted to track you down and see one of your shows. So he sees the show, is really impressed, tells Jack Parr, when I get back, I'm writing an article about you for Esquire magazine. Jack Parr's like, yeah, sure you are. So the war ends, he gets released, takes a boat back to San Francisco. I believe his wife, who he'd met and married, they didn't know each other very long during the war. So meets up with his wife, calls his mother. It's like, Jack, we keep getting phone calls. It's the studios, the radio networks, and everybody wants you. It's like, why? Because of the story in Esquire. There's a story about being like, yeah. So he has to track down the article, and it's very glowing. He lands himself a contract at RKO Studios. Not very much comes of it. He makes a few movies, says he mostly does promotional stuff for other people's movies. And one of these movies he made I've actually seen, and I tracked it down because of him and another individual that's in it. It's a film called Love Nest from 1951. There's the principal couple. I cannot remember their names. They're forgotten. But the secondary couple is Jack Parr and a pre-star Marilyn Monroe.
Wow.
And this is about a husband and wife that decide to take on being superintendents of an apartment building. And then Jack Parr is the guy's best friend. Not a great movie. Very forgettable, but interesting that those two are in it. So he's at RKO for a while. He's at 20th Century Fox for a little while. He becomes kind of the go-to summer replacement for a lot of radio shows, to the point that there was a columnist that was saying, that it's truly summer when you hear Jack Parr's voice on the radio. So he does that for a few years. He goes out to New York, does a few things for television, including 2 years on CBS's morning show. Eventually gets the Tonight Show assignment, which is not thought of the way it's thought of now. And he just goes gangbusters with that. Has a great career. I had one more story of his I thought was funny to share. So he's become very popular. And so he gets invited to be on Person to Person, which is the Edward R. Murrow show, where they send a camera crew to wire your house, and then you show the audience your house, have them meet your wife and your kids. So CBS keeps sending people out to do preliminary work, and they're getting ready to do the show live, and so they've got all these technical people, and they're wiring the house, and they're moving things, and it's chaotic, and there's people coming in and out of the house, and Jack Parr is having to show people around the house where things are, how we're going to set this up, how we're going to film that. So he's doing this, and he's down in his living room or something. He sees a woman. So basically, they've all been men up to this point, but I see this woman looking confused. So I'm like, I suppose you want to see the place too. It's like, well, yeah, if that's all right. It's like, okay, come with me. Shows through the entire house. I want to say it's like a 17-room house. So after they're done, he's like, okay, well, any questions? Oh, that was great, Mr. Parr. Is there anything else I can do for you? It's like, well, yeah, my friends are out in the car. Would you mind showing them the house too? He's like, I thought you were like a script girl or something from CBS. It's like, no. It's like my friends and I were driving around and we saw some commotion, and they picked me to go in and see what was up.
Did he show the rest of them?
I wish he doesn't say, but that would have been the way to cap that story. It's like, come on in.
So the reality is he probably cussed her out and kicked her out of the house.
It probably is, yeah. But that was fun. I also finished up House of Cards.
Oh, yeah? Which I have not caught up on.
Yeah, House of Cards.
I'm on, I think, season 4 or 5. Mm-hmm. Kind of lost my way after Trump got elected.
Yeah. House of Cards, of course, was based... there was an original novel that was turned into a miniseries in Great Britain that actually ended with the lead character's death, but it was so well received that the guy went back and kind of retconned it and wrote some additional books, and then they changed the ending when they did the movie series to allow the Francis Urquhart character, who would become Francis Underwood in the American version, to survive and become Prime Minister. I've seen all 3 seasons of that show, and it's British seasons. They're like 3 or 4 episodes seasons. Yeah. And then I was really excited when the show came to be, and of course David Fincher was involved as a producer, and Bo Williamson, who's kind of a playwright. He also wrote... what was the name of that film where George Clooney played a presidential candidate from about 2013? I'm blanking. Are you
thinking like The Ides of March? Or?
Yeah. So he wrote that. And so he was brought in to do the treatment for the net. And this was like, it's amazing that's only was like 2013. And that was kind of like the dawn of the Netflix original streaming series. And that's just, streaming is ubiquitous now. And it was like a new thing, in 2013, which was barely any time ago. This was, and I think eventually Bill Williamson left the show. It was really smart and really well written, and then it got to be less so.
Yeah.
And it's really a mixed bag of a show. I would say seasons 1, 2, and 4 are really good, and 3, 5, and 6 are not so good. And of course, with what happened to Kevin Spacey, they'd actually started production. They'd filmed an entire episode of season 6, which was intended to be the final season, and when these Kevin Spacey allegations came to light and he was kicked out, they had to regroup really quickly. They decided they did want to finish up. They had Robyn Wright, to play Claire Underwood. And it just feels like they took kind of what they'd planned and they had to alter it enough. Like they'd already brought in Greg Kinnear and Diane Ladd, had been signed up, obviously, because they were able to get them on pretty short notice. But it just feels slipshod. It gets really kind of ridiculous. And I thought season 5 got really kind of ridiculous too. It's an imperfect point of comparison, but V.C. Andrews, do you know anything about V.C.
No.
Andrews, Flowers in the Attic? V.C. Andrews wrote this series of books, and then she died like in the late 80s, but she left a lot of outlines apparently for other material, so other people continued to write her stuff under her name decades after she died. I don't want to get into an entire discussion about V.C. Andrews, but it's kind of gross and over the top and crazy. And season 6, and to a lesser extent season 5 of House of Cards, just it's crazy. Like it just doesn't work. There used to be a sense of reality to it, especially in the early seasons, and there's just not. And the way they end it isn't a series ending, it's a season ending. It does, and I'm a guy who likes ambiguous endings.
Yeah.
But it felt like, okay, now there's going to be season 7. Because there's so many plot lines left open, so much uncertainty. One particular character's plot line gets more or less wrapped up, but it just didn't work for me.
I think they're probably hoping the political climate will calm down and they can come back to making this show back being what it was before Donald Trump got elected.
Yeah, and there's certain elements. There's a Russia scandal in season 6 having to do with interference, and so there's things that they're borrowing. Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous.
Yep.
Well, I think we've meandered quite a bit. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about at this?
No, I think I'm good.
All right. Well, I guess we will wrap that up. This particular episode up. I'm Nate.
And I'm Rob.
And this has been Rob and Nate Record a Podcast.